Let's start with the basic snowball block. Two of the rulers that I've invented are the snowball rulers, and they look like this. They look very similar to each other, but one is called the 3x3 grid and the other one the 4x4 grid. You can do the very same thing with both of these rulers. Let me go over some of the components of the ruler. You will notice that there's 5 built-in sizes to each ruler, and these are just popular block sizes that we make as quilters, but you can piece any size rectangle or square with this ruler. Let me show you a little bit of other differences with the two rulers. Both of these blocks are 6.5 inches square. You will notice that this corner is a little deeper than this corner. This is made with the 3x3 ruler. This is made with the 4x4 ruler. Remember, if you've made a snowball block what I now call the old-fashioned way, you started out with a big square and then 4 little squares. And with the little squares, you drew a diagonal line across the middle, placed the little squares at each corner, and then sewed across the diagonal lines. Well, invariably, the sewing machine wants to eat this little corner, which kind of helps skew your block out of shape. And then the technique was to cut off the ear and then press it open. Again, this further exacerbated the problem, so when you finished your block, it was skewed out of place. Well, we're not going to use this old-fashioned method anymore. We're going to use the ruler revolution way. If I can direct your attention to my board here, these are the steps that it takes to make a snowball block. What you do is you start out with 2 squares that are the same size, and these are actually 6.5 inch squares. Put right sides together, and then take the snowball ruler and lay the ruler on the squares, line it up with the measurement here, which is 6.5 inches, and then I use a sew line marking pencil, and I mark the vertical, the horizontal lines, and then the diagonal lines in the corner of each of all 4 of the corners. So once it's marked, it looks like this. Then I take it to the machine and I sew on these little diagonal lines. Once it's sewn, I take my scissors and I cut between the 2 layers. Now, if you cut all the way through both layers, you're going to end up with a different block. So be sure you're only cutting between the 2 layers on the vertical and the horizontal lines that you drew. Press open the corners and then take a squaring up ruler and square up these 2 sides, turn the block, square the other 2 sides, and you end up with a snowball block. The last step is to cut off the little ears in the back. And if you double sew up here where we sewed around on the diagonal lines, if you skip over a 1/2 inch and sew again, whenever you cut off a 1/4 inch on the back side here to cut off the little ears, you get the bonus of the half square triangles. So let me show you how to make that little block. I have 2 squares here on my mat, and I'm going to take my ruler, lay it on the square, and the square that I want to show up is my accent color, which is the corner here, will be the square that I will actually mark. Then with a sew line marking pencil, I will mark all 4 of the diagonal lines, the vertical lines, and the horizontal lines. Once they're marked, I'll take and put right sides together. And whenever there's small blocks like this, I usually don't even pin them. I just hold them in place and sew them. So take it to your machine, and we're just going to sew on the diagonal lines. And once I get to the other side over here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my unit, and I'm going to sew again on the next diagonal line. And these are great blocks if you want to do chain piecing. It really speeds up the process even that much more. And it's a great little block if you're teaching a new piecer how to piece. This is all the sewing, and you notice the only time I'm cutting my thread is right at the end of sewing the block. The next step is to take my scissors, and I'm just going to pinch these open in between here. place my scissors in and cut across. And it's not real important to be super accurate at this stage, just as long as you're kind of cutting somewhere in the approximate middle of your square. And once it's cut, take your iron and press the corners out. Now, I mentioned that I didn't cut my threads as I was sewing, except whenever I finished, and the reason why is those threads will clean up in this process. Once it's pressed out, I take a squaring up ruler, and I'm going to take the top of my ruler and lay it at the top of my square and at the side of my square. And take a quick peek on the other two edges just to make sure it's lined up. Then hold it in place and cut off these two little edges. Rotate the block, lining up the ruler at the top and the side again, and cut off these two edges. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, if you double sew those corners, and I trim off leaving 1/4 inch seam allowance, it would automatically have little built-in half square triangles. Now, I didn't, just to save time, I didn't do the double sewing, but you can see where you get the little half square triangles. So you cut off all 4 corners. And remember, this is your last step to do, because this also helps stabilize this block and helps to make it come out perfectly every time. So you can see how quickly I did that, and I have a perfect snowball block. Now, that's the first technique to use in making the snowball blocks. There is another technique that I use. Let me clear this away. The other technique that I use is this one here. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I said that we could snowball any size square or any size rectangle with this ruler. This is the technique that you would do that with. You would start out with your square or your rectangle, and in this example, I'm going to snowball all 4 corners with a different fabric. But this is where I could choose to make these two match, maybe just snowball 1 corner, 2 corners, or 3 corners, or even snowball them a different size. So starting with your square, your rectangle, again in this example I have 4 squares, and I still do my marking with my ruler on the big square. And by that I mean I just take my ruler, lay it on my square, line it up, and mark the lines in the diagonal corners. Now this time I don't have to mark the vertical and the horizontal line because I'm not going to use it. Then when I go to the machine, I take one of these little squares, insert it under the corner, and sew across. Rotate my block, take another little square, slide it under, sew across. I do that 4 times. Press it open, square it up like I did a moment ago on the basic snowball, and you have your little snowball block. Again, the last step is cutting off the ears. So let me show you how to do that with a rectangle. Now this can be done on any size rectangle or square, and for this example I'm going to use the corner that is on the 6.5 inch block. So I'm going to line up the corner of the 6.5 inch measurement on my block here, and then I'm going to take my marking pencil and I'm going to draw a diagonal line. Then I'm going to find the same 6.5 inch measurement, line up the edge of my ruler in the bottom, draw my line. Slide my ruler over, again finding the 6.5 inch measurement, draw my line, and then the last marking is the top here. So you'll notice what I did with my ruler is I just slid it around like this. Okay. Now the next step is to go to the machine, and I have my 4 little squares here. And at the machine, I'm going to lay my piece of fabric under the machine, take one of the little squares, and just position it in the corner. Now, just as long as my little square is bypassing the diagonal line, your square is the perfect size. And you don't have to be real exact either at this point, just as long as you're sewing on the diagonal line. Okay, once I get to the edge here, I'm going to take another little square, lay it under the next diagonal line, and sew again. Once you get started on these little snowball blocks, and especially if you're chain piecing, the smaller ones you can make in about 2 minutes. And like if you're doing charity quilts or need a fast baby quilt, perfect little block to make. Okay, and you can see at this point it looks a little bit messy, but we're going to clean all that up as we go along here. So I'm going to take my iron, and I'm going to press the corners up and away from the center of the block. And the inside surface of a snowball is a perfect place to do applique work, fancy quilting stitches, or maybe even do some fussy cutting with your fabric to have a little design there. Now to trim this up, I'm going to take my ruler, and I'm just going to line up the top edge and the side edge here of my ruler. And just like we did on the basic snowball, I'm going to cut these little slivers off. Turn the block and do the other side here. It's a little bit bigger. Okay. Now the last step, I would cut off the little ears back here, but as you can see, I have a perfect snowballed rectangle with this technique. Now another technique that I mentioned is that you can snowball any size rectangle or square with different size corners. And this is the technique that you would use to do that. And I've already marked my back corners here with a small diagonal corner, a little bit larger, and then larger here. And I've done my little squares. So the way I would do that is, just like I've been doing, lay my little square under the corner. And sew across. And again, you can just snowball 1 corner, 2 corners, 3 corners, or 4 corners. You don't necessarily have to snowball all 4 corners of a block. And you can get some really interesting effects when you start snowballing just 1, 2, or 3 corners, or even the different sizes like I'm doing now. One of the neat things that you can do with a square that you snowball different size corners with is to make like a tree top. All you have to do is add the trunk of the tree. Okay, the last corner. I'm going to press out the corners. I'm not going to cut these off. I think now that you understand the little technique, but just to show you how you can get different size corners. But they clean up just exactly like we've been doing in the other, with the other snowball blocks. The next way to use the snowball ruler is snowballing any quilt block that you make. And when you snowball, like this is a snowballed 9 patch, this is a snowballed strip, you get a really interesting effect after you snowball it. And I'm going to show you here on my design board exactly how to snowball a 9 patch. You start out by creating 2 strip sets, and that's what I have here. And then you cut your square for your snowballing your corners, or you can snowball the corners like I've been doing here with individual little squares. But in this technique, I'm going to show you how to do it with this big square. So once you have your strip sets sewn like this, cut your strip sets apart, and you'll create your strips that will be sewn together like so, and you end up with a 9 patch. Once you end up with your 9 patch, take your big square, put right sides together, and sew across the diagonal corners. Once you have that done, you do your cutting just like we've been doing on some of the other examples, where you cut in between the 2 layers going across both directions. Press it out, square it up, and you're going to end up with a block that looks like this. Now what I've done with this block is I've gone back after it was completed and I've cut it apart going down the middle both directions, took these little pieces, twisted and turned them, and this blue and yellow quilt that is hanging over here on the wall is actually a quilt that was made with this technique. It's this quilt here. This is another colorway with the same technique, where you can see real quickly that it no longer looks like a snowball anymore. And that's the fun part with the snowball block. A lot of times people will make a basic snowball quilt the old-fashioned way that I showed you in the beginning of this segment, only to find out it was too tedious and they weren't satisfied with the results because the blocks would skew. But as you can see with the Ruler Revolution snowball rulers, your snowball blocks end up perfect every time. So let me show you some other designs that you can make with this ruler. Now that I've shown you how easy it is to make a snowball block with the Ruler Revolution snowball rulers, let me show you some examples. This is a little snowball quilt that I snowballed opposite corners, and so you end up getting a slanted star with this quilt. This shows how that you can snowball different size corners even within your same block, and snowballing sashing even gives a block a nice effect. And remember, we were snowballing rectangles a moment ago? This is a rectangle that's been snowballed with 2 corners. These are little squares that have been snowballed for 3 corners, and it makes a music note. This is just a little miniature with 9 different little plain snowball blocks. This one is made with 4 snowball blocks with 2 corners of each of the snowball block snowballed and then put together with a little yo-yo for a flower. And this is a great place to showcase your pretty embroidery work, applique, that sort of thing. Typically we do that just on a plain square, but you can see with this example it just adds a little pizzazz to it. We can't forget the guys. This is to show how you can snowball your sashing, add more sashing, and snowball again. This is a slight rectangle, almost looks square, but it is a rectangle, a cute little pumpkin. And remember in the segment I was talking about snowballing different blocks? Well, this is 4 half-square triangles that have been snowballed on the corners. This is just 4 small snowballs put together for the block. This is a block where I just snowballed the one corner of each of 4 squares and put them together. Again, this is snowballed half-square triangles, snowballed on all 4 corners of the half-square triangle. This shows, again, another example how to snowball different sizes within the same block. And snowballs really take on a life of their own when you start adding them to other blocks. They really create some interesting effects within your block. Just snowballing the corner of some little blocks or little squares in that block. Snowballing strips. This is the example I was showing a moment ago for the blue and yellow quilt. And this is something that I'm working on, and I'll show you more a little bit later in a different segment on what this is all about. But a neat little embroidery technique. And then you can even turn your snowball blocks into pinwheels. And then these are just the 3 different examples of snowballing half-square triangles. You can see how differently they look by where you snowball the corners of those units. I was showing you some blocks that you can make with a snowball ruler, and this is to show you how you can take those blocks and incorporate them into your quilts. And this is a little wall hanging. Here's your snowball right here in the center, and then there's 8 units, these little squares here, where I've just snowballed one corner of those squares put them around the center snowball, added some cornerstone blocks, and then set the quilt on point. So from one block, I ended up with a tabletop size quilt. And as I mentioned, when you start mixing your snowballs in with other blocks, how they take on a really interesting effect. Well, here's your little basic snowball here, and it's been sashed and then added to another block. These are half square triangles that have been snowballed and put together. Another fun thing to do is if you're in a hurry to make a little quilt and you find some cheater cloth type fabric, you can snowball the little cheater cloth. Now this piano keyboarder that I made on this little quilt was made from the leftovers that I trimmed off of the corners when I was actually doing my snowballs. So remember, all the pieces of your snowball block are usable. You can also start out by strip piecing your fabric before you cut out your squares for your snowballs, as I've done with this little worm quilt. And this is one of the examples made by strip piecing first and then snowballing the strip set like I've done here. And depending on how you twist and turn those individual units, you can get a whole bunch of different looks out of that one block. And this is another example how when you snowball a 9-patch, like I showed over on the board a moment ago, that you can end up with a totally different look. So as you can see, snowball blocks can be very versatile. They can be very easy to make. And all of our rulers are available on our website, and also for wholesale customers, they're available through most of the major distributors. And then we also have patterns for several of our quilts, as I'm showing here. This pattern is for this quilt over here, and again, a little different colorway. The quilt that's behind me here, we have a pattern that's in the works for this quilt. It's very similar to the little table topper that I showed you, but it's been made into a quilt. And then this is another pattern that we're working on. It's called Black Lightning. And if you'll notice, to the big quilt, I've attached this little quilt. Whenever I made this quilt and I got my bonus half square triangles by double sewing the corners, I incorporated those half square triangles in the border. Then I took the leftover half square triangles, snowballed them together, and made this little miniature quilt. So again, everything is usable from this technique. Thank you for watching, and I invite you to visit our website at www.rulerrevolution.com, or if you have any questions, our phone number is 936-520-1928. Thank you.